Thanks for joining me in this segment of Belly Flopping into Mysticism. My name is Penny Colpin. I'm continuing on with the series on better metaphors. I know it hasn't gotten a lot of traction, but that's all right. I want to finish it and then move on to potentially other useful things. Sorry for the delay in getting this one out. I'd recorded several before I went on an extended trip. And then somehow the one for this segment got deleted from Zoom. And so I don't know what happened. So I'm going to go ahead and re-record this one and then finish out the series. Segment 9 for better metaphors. This whole segment, as a reminder, is about how the dominant metaphor for serious mental illness, put that in quotes, is that of these are all like diabetes. And Robert Whitaker once asked, this was probably 30 years ago, 25, 30 years ago, asked a psychiatrist, where's the proof of that? And the psychiatrist answered, well, it's just a metaphor, which means there isn't truth behind it. I mean, it was the theory. And so for me, I have dozens of better metaphors. It doesn't take much to come up with better metaphors than that diabetes analogy, which has been used for 30 some years. This one deals with transformational metaphors. And one of them is from my book. I actually have the print version available. I have it both through Amazon and the other booksellers. Ingram Spark makes it available for print on demand. One thing I've learned, in case you do want to write a book, don't use a word like Kinsakuri in the title, because when I talk to strangers about my book and they're interested. And when I say it, nobody knows what Kinsakuri is. Now, when I describe it, they're like, wow, that's a great metaphor. Kinsakuri, I've shared it before. Here's the cover. I went with the thought bubble as kind of like the mind. And then instead of solely dealing with gold as the seams between all these parts, I wanted to make it more colorful and playful and that type of thing. So all the lines there represent cracks and fractures that have been put back together with fun, colorful material. And the idea behind Kinsakuri is that Japanese art form. It's also called kintsugi, Kintsugi, is that you take a piece of pottery and break it into several pieces, and then you pull it back together with gold. And this is the most important part, is the piece is more valuable for having gone through that process. Okay, and that's where I did ask a few of the people who I had a chance to speak with when I first launched the channel to see if they would be willing to read the manuscript. And this is both in the ebook, but Robert Whitaker, who most people in this space who've been harmed by the dominant biomedical model know who he is, founder of Mad in America, wrote books, Mad in America and Anatomy of an Epidemic. But I love his opening line is, rarely has a book had a better title than Kinsakuri Mind. I don't think he'd heard of that metaphor before. So that's quite a compliment. So thank you, Bob. So that is one of them. Well, that is, and again, for me, that is so much a better metaphor that even though, as I was coming up with the title of the book, I was like, that metaphor is just too good. Even though it'll make it harder for people to remember my book when I'm talking to them, it was still worth it, in my opinion. But in hindsight, maybe that should have been the sequel. So anyway, another transformational metaphor is that of alchemy. That ties back into the Middle Ages when people, actually were believing that physically, how can we turn lead into gold? And a number of scholars looking at that period of time is that was a metaphor of how to take this, it might be the drudgery of your life, and turn it into something golden. And it has a number of themes through there. The major area of my German master's degree was actually medieval German literature. I know, one of those really handy degrees, but it was fascinating to read and study some of that, and then to recognize, wow, that was actually talking about as much of I don't know if you call it spiritual transformation, a growth transformation, an emergent transformation, that's for sure. Let's see, another one, and this is one that came to me when I was still in Banff in the early stages of the breakdown. back in 1998 or breakout is that of birth. Okay, that this entity is emerging from something into something else. And I've long said you don't shove the baby back in, but that is what this model is of we will, shove, manipulate, coerce, drug you back into a state that we find acceptable too often. Too often. Now, this is where, in talking about the need for reform, across thousands and thousands of people, there's nothing is 100%. That there's just been too much of that approach in terms of these types of spiritual transformational processes, of ignoring that spiritual component, and therefore we are going to put you back in to the role that broke you open. That doesn't make sense to a person trying to go through this process. Similarly, the chick emerging from the egg, I mentioned in the book, I have a chapter on ego collapse, and how a friend of mine back in 98, he had gone through some of these experiences. He described it, he was the one who gave me the concept. He introduced the concept of ego collapse, which even then resonated in those first couple of weeks. And he talked about hatching from the ego instead of hatching from the egg. But again, there's no going backwards for that chick to go back into that egg. And so how do you help it in this expanded state operate in a level of consciousness that incorporates these pieces and pulls them together and integrates them, which also ties in with the individuation process that Carl Jung talked about, of the need to integrate the contents of the shadow, as opposed to continuing to force it into exile, where the concept of exile ties in with internal family systems, which I've mentioned in some other videos. Now, similarly, that butterfly from a cocoon is that process of transforming. My understanding is it's a pretty gooey, messy process. But what emerges is something that people find beautiful, and many people would find the butterfly even more beautiful, more colorful, more noteworthy than the caterpillar that went into that chrysalis process. And that's where hopefully we can continue to work to develop processes of how do we help bring those butterflies, if you will, into their full functionality. Process of making steel. Okay, the idea of pressing something, burning off the dross, okay, which burning in and of itself could be considered a transformational process or part of a bigger process in terms of from the residue, what happens. And of course, there I can touch on to the phoenix rising from those ashes of what gets burned. That's a different one. Anyway, and then of course, coal into diamonds, just from the sheer force and pressure involved. And I don't mean the pressures and stress just from this realm, which can contribute. That's why I've always called my experience a stress breakdown. Stress breakdown. I broke down because of accumulated stress that never, I kept shoving stuff off into the shadow until it finally erupted and wiped things out. But you continue to push things under stress. That process was stressful. That process involved forces and weights that I'd never heard about nor read about as part of that process, which apparently the mystics are aware of. And that's where that concept of the mystics swimming with delight in some of these states of consciousness, and the psychotic person, which I'm not a fan of that word, but the person going through this, falling into some of these states of consciousness accidentally, flounder and flail. I did. I finally figured out how to let myself come through that process, but it could have been done a lot sooner had I been able to meet up with someone who was familiar with not just Carl Jung, but Stan Grof's work, Joseph Campbell's contribution, John Weir Perry, and some of those folks. And that I'll do a series at some point of some of those folks whose work from 50 years ago, 50, almost 60 years ago, they were exploring consciousness research. And for that to have been suppressed, I consider it criminal. But anyway, under all that stress, what happens to coal? You get diamonds from it. You do get something beautiful. You do get something. And granted, the diamond, some people, like to have it cut certain ways and have it polished and all of that as part of the final process. But that transformation of something like coal that gets transformed, if you compare what coal looks like to a diamond, they don't look anything like each other, at least from what I understand. So the thing about all these is the transformation, there's no going back, right? It transforms from one thing to another. And I get that, you can make the argument that I'm not the same person as I was yesterday. That every day that I wake up, I've changed a little bit. I've grown a little bit. My hair's a little bit longer, or my fingernails, whatever, right? So there's that part of it. But I could make the argument that these are the dramatic changes. These are full-bodied, not recognizing what results as compared to what went into that process. And those are what I mentioned here. So using those kinds of metaphors, or if you know somebody who's struggling with what you might think of as non-ordinary states of consciousness, you might either keep an ear out for how they're trying to describe it, because that's one part of this. And I don't have a separate video on it, but two books I read earlier this year mentioned how these processes or these experiences with these extreme states of consciousness, the word ineffable came up frequently. And that I actually looked it up just to make sure I understood it correctly. But basically, it means cannot be described in words. It's so intense that people have a hard time describing it in words. So if someone's trying to describe their experience, I believe that's why we need more metaphors as a way of recognizing, oh, this is how this person is trying to describe their experience. So anyway, just wanted to get caught up and re-record this one. And then, like I say, I'll go ahead and continue on with this series and then figure out how to come up with something that is potentially of value to other folks. So have a great day. Thanks for joining me. And I really appreciate your support. And I forgot, it's been a while since I've recorded. This is not intended to be medical advice or anything like that. And I'm just sharing what helped or what would have helped had I known of it or thought of it. These are tools that would have helped me. And all I can do is hope that by sharing some of them, it may help some other people. So have a good one. And thanks for joining me.